else are employers required to do? Well, beginning in January 2015, employers are required to offer insurance to an employee's dependents. Dependents are defined as children, stepchildren, foster children, and adopted children up to age 26, regardless of their marital status. However, the employer is not required to make the insurance that is offered to an employee's dependents affordable. This is really significant because it means that the employer can require dependents to pay 100% of the cost of insurance. And the question I always get is, will this happen? And my answer is, it could. And here's why. I'm going to give you a little bit of background to understand why this is probably a pretty likely thing that we're going to see. So in the past, insurance companies charged a certain rate or premium for insurance based on the insurance company deciding who it would insure and what types of claims it would cover, right? Well, one of the things that changed under Obamacare is that it told insurance companies that they could no longer deny people for pre-existing conditions and that they had to cover things such as certain procedures and certain medications that they didn't cover before. So those things are great things to an individual because now they won't be declined coverage for a pre-existing condition, and there are certain things that are covered that maybe weren't covered in the past. So those are good things. But what you need to understand is how that impacts the entire insurance landscape. So in order to deal with these new requirements, what happens is that insurance companies start to charge more money for their products in order to make sure there's enough money to cover these new costs, like people that would have declined before because they had certain conditions that they didn't want to cover that are so-called catastrophic losses, or they are covering different procedures that they didn't want to cover before. So what happens to do that is the insurance company starts to collect more money and the cost of insurance goes up. So what that means to the whole landscape is that the insurance company charges the employer more for insurance, and the employer in turn charges the employees more for insurance. Now, the federal government is trying to control this increase in cost by collecting penalties, both from individuals, we talked about already, and from employers. But even with this, most actuaries and insurance companies agree that the cost of insurance is going to go up. So because of this, it is not going to be uncommon for employers to do the best they can to make employees' coverage as affordable as possible. But it's more likely than not they're going to require dependents to pay more for their coverage, up to 100% of the cost of coverage. Remember also that as the law stands today, if a dependent is offered an employer-sponsored plan, then the dependent cannot qualify for a subsidy on the exchange. Now, I'm going to re-emphasize this because it's a really important part for you to understand. So if your employer offers your dependents coverage, even if your dependents are required to pay for 100% of the cost of that coverage, your dependents are not eligible for any kind of subsidy on the insurance exchange. This is true whether or not your dependent accepts the coverage. So if your dependent is offered coverage and they're required to pay 100% and they decline it, they cannot qualify for a subsidy on the exchange. So we've been talking about dependents. What about spouses? Well, the first thing you need to know is that employers are not required to offer insurance to spouses under Obamacare. There's a little bit of a catch-22 here because if the employer does offer insurance to a spouse, that insurance is not required to be affordable. So just like dependents, employers can require spouses to cover 100% of the cost of the insurance. And if you recall, anyone who is offered insurance through an employer-sponsored plan cannot be eligible for a subsidy. So what this means is that if an employer does not offer coverage to a spouse, the spouse can still get insurance on the exchange and possibly qualify for a subsidy if they're eligible. On the other hand, if the employer does offer spousal coverage, the employer has no obligation to make such coverage affordable. The employer could require the spouse to pay up to 100% of the cost of the plan. If the employer does offer spousal coverage, the spouse becomes ineligible to qualify for a subsidy on the exchange, even if the spouse does not accept the coverage. Finally, if you, your dependents, and/or your spouse are eligible for Medicaid or any other type of assisted program in your state, this will not change.